What is up, podcast land, caffeinated biblechatter people? Thank you for being here. Obviously, I say this every time that my voice comes over the intro like this, so you already know it. I have no need of saying it, but this is a solo episode, and so that's okay. This doesn't mean it's going to be a short one, but we did want to bridge the gap in our series of prayer and fasting and the importance of that. And so, Lord willing, this one will go okay. And then we will jump back together, me and Big Kai, probably the two of us, in a duo again. And we'll finish up fasting, Lord willing. That will be that'll be the last of it. So it should be a little bit of a 3-week deal. So again, thanks for being here. And what are we going to do with the subject matter of fasting this episode? Well, I just want to give you two cool. So last week we tried to lay out, we asked the question in the title, should we be fasting today? And okay, like spoiler alerts, really not spoiler. I mean, even if you clicked on that and haven't listened to much of it, you probably know that the answer to that was yes. We're telling you that the Bible is saying to fast. Okay. And so we laid out some stuff and some things that I think we talked a lot about the physical side of things, which it's extremely important. Like, I don't want to, we kept saying that wasn't the most important thing, and it's not, but it is still important. And so we tried to talk about, 1 Corinthians 6, our bodies being the temple of the Holy Ghost, 1 Corinthians 9, the fact that the way we steward our body is a big deal in soul winning and the mission. And we've kind of talked about that before in the context that maybe the way we steward our bodies is actually connected with the crown if it leads to further service and obedience and that kind of thing. 1 Corinthians 9 is an interesting passage. You go do some Bible study on your own on that. So we tried to lay that out. We tried to just, to lay out the physical side of things, but also give you some spiritual truths connected with it. And so the next episode, we want to dive further into those spiritual truths. But in this short episode, I just want to give you two really cool stories when studying this stuff out. These come up in the references and they show up, and they're just really cool and they're powerful because, my whole thing with studying prayer and fasting recently is just that I'm like, I know that I should do it. I know it's a good thing. I know that it's prayer on steroids, but like, what's really going on here? Like, why, how much does God move through prayer and fasting and that kind of thing? And so when studying it out, these two passages came to mind and they show up. So I want to take you there. But before I do, I am sipping on a cup of coffee as we do on this podcast, whether I'm with someone, whether it's both of us, whether it's three of us, whether it's just Kyle, we sip on coffee. And I'm sipping on a cup of good stuff. And if you've followed the podcast for a while, you've heard me talk about them. Good stuff is now good stuff for me is what Elianos used to be for me. I forgot that like early in this podcast, I was all about Elianos. I don't know if you remember those days. If you've been around listening long enough, you may. I used to shout out Elianos, but now it's good stuff. That's my spot. And again, it's a coffee shop in downtown Dallas, Georgia, not Dallas, Texas. For those of us that are local, most of you that listen here know where we're at and where we live. You don't know my address. Some of you do, but relatively where I live. But it's a good cup of coffee. I'm going to take a sip. It is daggum good. And you say, Dylan, what'd you get? Well, I got a honey latte. It's what I always get. Anywhere I go out and about, I get a honey latte. When I go to Starbucks, except for Starbucks, their lattes are trash. So I just get a pike roast with some honey in it. But everywhere else, I get a plain latte with honey. And good stuff is good stuff. So it's awesome. Go check it out if you hadn't. It's a cool little coffee shop in downtown Dallas. Small little deal. It's awesome. All right. So I gave you this reference last week, and this is a reference you're familiar with if you're somewhat of a student of the Word. But it was Matthew 17:21, where the disciples are trying to cast out a demon, an unclean spirit, and they're having a hard time with it, and they're actually not able to cast them out. And verse, just for some context, Matthew 17, verse, well, dang, let's see. Verse 14, it says, and when they were come to the multitude, there came to him a certain man kneeling down to him and saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is a lunatic. Interesting study on that word. And sore vexed, for oft times he falleth into the fire and oft into the water. And here's a little plug. This has nothing to do with fasting, but it's interesting how much demonic influence shows up around water. And fire is an interesting thing, but specifically water. It's interesting when in another passage, when I can't remember if that was the legion or what, I can't remember, but when Christ cast out the unclean spirits, cast out the demons, and they said, let us go into the swine. And they went into the swine, and where did the swine immediately run? Well, they ran to the water. Interesting. We don't have time to dive into that, but it's an interesting study. Okay. So he says, look, my son is oftentimes, he's a lunatic. He's oftentimes fallen into the fire and oftentimes fallen into the water. Verse 16, and I brought him to thy disciples and they could not cure him. And these are guys following Christ. These are guys that know Christ intimately, that they're friends with Christ. They're disciples of his. Verse 17, then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I suffer you? Bring him hither to me. And Jesus rebuked the devil. That's what in our King James Bible demons are called. There's more than one general devil. There's small devils, just like there's the Son of God, and he has made us small sons of God. Okay, again, this is not an episode on demons and demonic influence. Maybe we'll do another episode on that. All right. It says in verse 19, then came the disciples of Jesus apart and said, why could we not cast them out? And Jesus said unto them, because of your unbelief. For verily I say unto you, if ye have faith as a grain of mustard seed, ye shall say unto this mountain, remove hence to yonder place, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible unto you. Okay. Verse 21, howbeit, this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. And so I said last week, but I'm so charged by that reference, because what could I be missing out on in my life and my intimacy with Christ and in my ministry? What could I be missing out on simply because I don't give myself to prayer and fasting? Sure, I pray. Probably could pray more fervently, more intentionally, more spiritually minded. But do I pray and fast? And I think, again, the large majority of Christianity today does not. And so it's interesting that he says in verse 20 that it's because of their unbelief that they weren't able to do that. Howbeit, this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. And so when I read across this passage a couple weeks ago, I kind of made a mental note that oftentimes the reason I don't pray and fast is because of my unbelief. Like, my unbelief is what drives the lack of prayer and fasting. And so maybe that's the case for you too, like me. And the reason we could say that is, why else would I never give myself to prayer and fasting if I can see clearly that the Bible lays out that it's such a beneficial thing? Why would I not give myself to it? Most likely because a lot of it's just because I love my flesh and I love what makes my flesh comfortable. And that's part of what fasting is to deny our flesh and to die. And that's why it makes prayer avail so much and all of that. But it could also just simply be because I just doubt, man, is the Lord really going to do anything just because of prayer and fasting? So it's a heart of unbelief. And so, man, just what a powerful reference. And so when coming across that, and then I'm like, man, let's do some studying on prayer and fasting. There's two stories. Really, I hope I get to both of them, because I'm 10 minutes in, which is not long, but I do have a tendency, if you've been around the podcast a while, I have a tendency to get a little wordy, even when I don't plan on it. But the first story I want to take you to is Esther. And I think I've mentioned, it's bad I'm getting to that age. I say stuff about the Bible in different contexts and different places, and I sometimes forget where where that was set at. And so if I've went into, I feel like I've talked about this in passing on the podcast. So if I have, maybe it'll be familiar to you. And if I haven't, then well, here you go. But in Esther, where is Esther in my Bible? That's a great question. All right, here we go. In Esther, you're familiar most likely with the story of Esther. Esther becomes queen, and she's a Jew, and she becomes a Gentile queen. And in chapter 1 of Esther, just to try to give you a quick rundown of the book of Esther, you have King Ahasuerus. His wife Vashti is removed as queen in chapter 1 because of her rebellion against him. He's looking for a new queen. He finds Esther in chapter 2. There's a lot of doctrinal, prophetical pictures we don't have time to get into. But so Esther becomes queen in chapter 2. Well, in chapter 3, you have this guy by the name of Haman on the scene. And Haman is very close with the king. He's involved in the palace and all the workings there. He's a bigwig. And we don't have time to dive into all the details, but long story short, he wants to wipe out the Jews. Okay. Well, remember, this is during a time where the Jews are not, they're in captivity, so they're not in Israel or anything like that. And so they're kind of spread out throughout this region, and Haman wants to wipe out the Jews. Okay. Well, he does not know that Esther, who is now the queen, he doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. Well, evidently Esther being queen, she has authority, but she doesn't have the ability to just say, no, we're not going to have that. And the reason we know that is because she makes a plan after talking with Mordecai, her uncle who raised her. They come up with a plan that Esther needs to go to the king to seek him on the fact that that's a bad request, and that the Jews, her people, need to be saved. Okay, and so you have this deal. What I think is a big transition and a big flip in the story of Esther, and it's in Esther chapter 4. Okay, so you have Mordecai coming to Esther, and he says to Esther in Esther 4:14, probably the most popular verse and maybe a good theme verse for the whole book. But he says this: "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time," okay, in other words, Esther, if you don't speak up and you don't do something about this, and we could pause right there, and man, there's a lot to be said about that. There's things that we know we need to partake in and give ourselves to in life, but it's hard, and we may be fearful, and there may be challenges and obstacles that come along with that. And it's easy to just be like, I'm just going to chill and not get involved in that. But Esther's like, Mordecai's like, Esther, you can't do that. Okay, this is a big deal. All right, so he says, "For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place, but thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And here it is, here's the phrase that people use a lot from Esther. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" And so that phrase there, "for such a time as this," we can all ask ourselves that question and remind ourselves of the truth that God's placed us where we're at in ministry and life, around the people that we're in contact with, in the churches that we serve in. God has placed us in those contexts for such a time as this. All right, God, in other words, God knows what he's doing. The providence of God is active in Esther's life. So you got to get what Mordecai's saying here. Esther, it's no coincidence that Haman is after the Jews and you have been promoted. All right. God knows what he's doing. You have been promoted to queen during this event for such a time as this. In other words, God has so saw fit to rise you up in this manner for this time because he's going to accomplish something through you. Man, we got to see our whole life through that lens of faith. That's how we trust the Lord. All right. And so he says that to him. All right. Now I want you to notice Esther's response, and it's such a great response. And what I like about this is the providence of God is already real and moving and working in Esther's life. He's already promoted her and placed her into this situation where he can use her in this way. But we still see that she calls for a prayer and fasting. All right. Verse 15, then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. In other words, hey, y'all return and tell Mordecai that this is what I'm saying. Verse 16, go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days. So this would be what we call nowadays a dry fast. So most of the fasting we do is we talk about water fast. Those are phenomenal. Nothing but, water or black coffee or whatever. But this is a dry fast. Don't eat anything. Don't drink anything. All right, for 3 days. There's a plug for the 72-hour fast if you're looking for an option. All right. Neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. So she's like, hey, me and my girls working for me underneath it, we're going to fast too. All right. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king. All right. So it's after this, in the midst of this fasting, that's how she's going to go and request such a big request from the king. So she knew this was a heavy, weighty thing, and she needed the Lord to go before her. Okay. And then she says this, which is, okay, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And this is why she was asking for a fast, because it's not according to the law. This is not something she's supposed to be doing. This is outside of her place and role. And if I perish, I perish. All right. Verse 17, so Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. And so we see here that she calls for all these people to fast and to pray. And she asked for that, again, for them to do that for 3 days. All right. Now, in this story, what's so crazy, again, we have to recognize the providence of God. God's already raised her up. He's placed her in the position she's in for such a time as this. So cool. And we can find rest in that with our lives too, as we trust the Lord and obey, and we can allow him to position us as he positions us. Okay. But Esther still realized, okay, you know what? I need the Lord to go before me in a supernatural way. And so this is a great example of, okay, when's a good time to fast? Well, if you're deeply desperate for something. Okay, I'm not saying that it's always got to be that always has to be the case, but it's like when you get to the place where you realize, man, I really need the Lord to work on my behalf. I need to crucify the flesh. I need it. What it is it's showing the Lord. It's positioning ourselves in such a place of humility that we're saying, Lord, we have no confidence in the flesh. That's what Paul said. We have no confidence in the flesh, and we are totally dependent upon you to move in this situation. All right. Now, when you get to chapter 5, that was the end of chapter 4. You get to chapter 5, verse 1, it says, now it came to pass on the third day. Now, that's key because we're going to say something about that. So they're still in the midst of the fast. Now, it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel and stood in the inner court of the king's house over against the king's house, and the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house over against the gate of the house. And it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, that she obtained favor in his sight. Now, look, this is in the midst of, she's about to do something that's unlawful. And she is finding favor in his sight. All right. Well, why is that? Well, I believe it's because the Lord's working. Okay. And the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said unto her, what wilt thou, Queen Esther? So he realizes, and this is what this whole golden scepter thing is all about, but he realizes she's coming for a request. All right. And so he's saying, Esther, what you got? And what is thy request? It shall be even given thee to half of the kingdom. Now, this is what's cool, is remember, this is an unlawful request. This is a big deal that she's about to go do, but she's asked for prayer and fasting. She's asked for people to beseech the Lord in this way for 3 days. Well, this is on the third day, so the fast is still going on. She's approached the king, and the king's bid her opportunity to ask whatever she wants, even to half the kingdom. All right? Interesting deal. But I like what's said here further down in verse 7 and 8. Then answered Esther and said, my petition and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, which we know she has, And if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. All right, so this is her deal. She's not actually giving the actual request yet. Because what's the request? Well, it's to protect the Jews. It's to save them, to not destroy them, to do exactly the opposite of what Haman's already talked the king into allowing. Again, that's unlawful. And so she hasn't actually made the request. Now, look, there's a lot of reasons for that. We could say it's because she wants Haman there to be a part of that, and maybe for it to blow up and all this kind of stuff. But really what I think it ties back to is the fact that the prayer and the fasting was still going on. And this was on the third day, which means she was wanting the fasting and the prayer to be fully exhausted before she actually made a request. And so I think we can see this cool deal where Esther is recognizing and understand. We already know she realizes the power of prayer and fasting because she's the one that called for it. But we can see her faith in the Lord through this avenue to the point where she's like, hey, I need every bit of that to take place before I make this huge, bold request. And I think that's so cool. Okay, and so what does that lead to? What does this prayer and fasting in the situation of Esther's life and the story of Esther, what does it lead to? Well, it leads to super crazy, it's a storybook type ending, at least for Haman, the ending of Haman. It's a storybook type ending in chapter 6 of how God spares the Jews. And so what happens in chapter 6 is the king can't sleep that night. And so again, was it coincidence that the king found favor in Esther when he looked on her when she was approaching him? No, it wasn't coincidence. People were praying and fasting and the Lord was working. Okay, again, is God's providence involved in all of this? Of course. He's already raised up Esther for such a time as this. But look, this is what you got to get from that. We're not Calvinists. We believe that God has providence and wants to work, but we also believe that he honors and works in the fact when people beg him and seek his face through prayer and fasting. So it's God's providence and it's God's working through prayer and fasting. Okay, so again, is it coincidence that Esther found favor in his sight? No. That happens in chapter 5. Okay. Is it coincidence that at the beginning of chapter 6 that the king is having a hard time sleeping? No, it's not coincidence. Because listen to what happens. On that night, verse 1 of chapter 6, on that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains. So he's exposed to the king or to the king's people what these two guys were doing, who sought to lay hands on the king of Ahasuerus. These two guys wanted to lay hold of King Ahasuerus. Mordecai exposed that, and the king found this out based on what was written in the Chronicles. All right, in verse 3, and the king didn't even know about it before this. Okay, so this is why it's not coincidence that the king couldn't sleep. The Lord's working this all out. Verse 3, and the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? He's like, man, what good have we magnified him because of this amazing thing he's done? Then said the king's servants and ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. Like, nope, we hadn't even done one single thing for him. Verse 4, and the king said, again, notice the timing of all this happening. The king can't sleep. He starts reading and he sees this. So we're seeing this promotion in the king's eyes, just like Esther found favor in his sight, this promotion in his mind of Mordecai because of what Mordecai has done. And at the very end of that, in the midst of this timing, look at the impeccable timing of the Lord. In verse 4, someone walks in the king's court and the king's aware of it. And the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman was come into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king, to hang Mordecai. Look at amazing timing. Mordecai is coming to speak, to ask the king, hey, not only can the Jews be extinguished, but can we hang this guy Mordecai? Before this, the king didn't even know who this guy was. But now he's just seen a viewpoint of this man and that he wants to promote him. All right. to speak. So again, Mordecai comes to speak to the king to hang Mordecai on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's servant said unto him, Behold, Haman standeth in the court. And the king said, Let him come in. All right, and long story short, Haman describes, or Haman and the king are in this conversation. The king is describing the situation of Mordecai and how this, but he doesn't say his name. And he's talking about how this man has done so much for the king and how this man needs to be promoted and all of this. And Haman thinks he's talking about him. And so Haman's like, yeah, king, do what you think. Okay, do what you got to do. So long story short, he ends up promoting Mordecai, and he ends up hanging Haman. All right, and then in the midst of that, in the midst of this passage, in the midst of this all, they end up meeting Esther, Haman, and the king, and Esther ends up getting her request out. And the request is, again, for the Jews to be spared, and they are. And again, Haman ends up on those gallows that he prepared for Mordecai. All right, so, man, I hope you see the coolness in that passage in chapter 6, that all of these, what seems like it would only be written in a fairy tale, all of these crazy things line up when it comes to timing, and it all lines up because, man, Esther had called for people to beseech the Lord through prayer and fasting. What an amazing thing. Again, it's like it's true in Matthew 17:21 that, certain things, howbeit this kind goeth not out but by prayer and fasting. The certain spiritual warfare that we may face, the certain temptations that we may face, the certain besetting sin that we may need victory of, sometimes what's needed is prayer and fasting. Esther was in such a place in this timing where she was desperate and she needed the Lord to work in an unusual way that was outside the context of what she was allowed to do. And so, I hope that encouraged you. All right. The other passage that I wanted to go to, I'm almost at 30 minutes, so I'm not going to go there. But it's 2 Chronicles chapter 20. And so I'd encourage you to go check it out. And it's about King Jehoshaphat. And King Jehoshaphat is got the Ammonites ready to wage war on them. And what he does in the midst of that is he actually prays and fasts. And it's a weird story because the Lord fights the battle for him, literally. All right, so go study it out. It's really cool. But that's what the Lord wants to do for us. If we'll lower ourselves in humility and we'll beseech him in prayer and fasting. Again, fasting is such a thing where we're lowering and weakening ourselves and acknowledging to the Lord that we have no confidence in the flesh and that we are desperately dependent upon him. So let those two stories encourage you to get serious about giving yourself to that. The Lord will work in it. So God bless you. And Lord willing, me and Kyle will see you together on the next one as we finish out this whole deal on prayer and fasting. So God bless you.